So that's a true division of the respiratory system. So the first part is called conducting zone, that is from like nose or mouth to nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and continuously until it reaches to the respiratory bronchiole. And near the respiratory bronchiole, alveolar ducts and alveoli, they are engaged in gas exchange process. So when they're engaged in gas exchange process, we call that respiratory zone. Now, this is the part that you got to understand it, okay? So pay attention to this one. So when you're breathing in air, the function that you want to achieve is that gas exchange, meaning the oxygen in that mixture. Air is a mixture of gases. So oxygen from that mixture should go from alveolus to the blood. And carbon dioxide should come from the blood to the alveolus. And then, so basically you're breathing in, we call that inspiration. So air goes in and then air comes out. That's called expiration or exhalation. So inhalation and exhalation. The whole thing is the breathing. That's what you want to achieve. So you want to take the air to the alveolus so that they can participate in the gas exchange. So in other words, the air that is stuck into that conducting zone structure, they have no function. That means they have no physiological role per se, because they are not involved in gas exchange. Gas exchange is taking place only at the bottommost part, meaning right here in the respiratory zone, not in the conducting zone. So whatever volume of air, when you're breathing in, whatever volume of air stuck in right here, we call that anatomical dead space, like anatomical dead space volume, meaning those volume of air has no respiratory function. In other words, they do not participate in the gas exchange. So only the part that reaches to the bottommost area, meaning the respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, and alveoli, they're the one that participating in the respiratory in the gas exchange process. Now, this 150 mil, just memorize the number right now. We're going to come back to that. That is technically 30% of what you breathe in normally. Okay, so you're going to come back to that number later on. Alveolar dead space. You have millions of alveoli in both lungs. Out of those millions, maybe some of them are collapsed or some of them are blocked. Some of them are not working. So obviously, the amount of air, no matter how tiny it is, they are not also participating in the gas exchange process. So to get this also considered as alveolar dead space, meaning they are not participating. The dead space in this case means they are not participating in the gas exchange. So together, their amount, whatever that amount is, like approximately 30% of what you breathe normally, so 150 ml, plus if you do have any collapsed or obstructed alveolus together, we call that total dead space, meaning that amount of air has no function. So that amount of air does not participate in any physiological role. Breathing, I just described, inhalation and exhalation. So when you take the air into the lung, that's called inhalation or inspiration. When you take air out from the lung to the environment, that's called expiration. Okay. Now, exactly what is the mechanism of it? We're coming to that point a little bit later. So let's talk about something, that how we do it. Okay. So let me mention the mechanism right now here. Also, just a simple mechanism, just to understand what is inhalation and what is exhalation. So inhalation means the movement of air in this case, from outside to your lung. Exhalation means movement of air from your lung to outside. Now, the first thing we have to understand that why air moves. The air moves based on the pressure difference. So wherever the air pressure is high, they are going to move to wherever the air pressure is low. So the air moves from high concentration of air to low concentration of air. Something very similar as diffusion. So air moves from wherever high amount of air, high pressure of air, to a low pressure area. Because we know that air pressure directly related with the concentration of air. More air molecules in a same volume will end up with high pressure. Okay. So now if you consider the volume, it is exactly like opposite. So there is a law given by a scientist called Boyle's. We call Boyle's law. So when you read the book, you will encounter that law. And I think a couple of slides later, I mentioned probably that law also. It's called Boyle's law. Okay. Boyle's law states that the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to the pressure at a constant temperature. So if we do not change the temperature, the volume of a gas is inversely proportional, meaning inversely means opposite. So if the volume increases, the pressure will decrease if we do not change the temperature. So let's say I'm sitting in a room which is like 10 by 14. That's the volume of that room right now where I'm sitting. Okay. Now, if we do not change the temperature, if we just increase the room size, let's say from 10 by 14, I break one wall and temporarily make it 12 by 14 or 15 by 14. That means we increase the volume. And if we do not allow any other air coming in from outside, then the pressure will automatically decrease. So when the volume increases, pressure decreases. When the volume decreases, pressure increases. This law is called Boyle's law, okay, of gas at constant temperature. So now why we're studying this? The reason we're studying this is because by controlling the volume of the lung, body controls the movement of air, because you have personally no control over the volume of the air or the air pressure of the environment. We can't control the immediate environmental air pressure. Depending on where we live, that's what the air pressure is. So if you live on the sea level, your air pressure is approximately, we call it 1 atmospheric pressure, or in short, 1 atm. Okay, or if you go through the mercury scale, I mentioned in a slide later on, it's like 760 millimeter of mercury. So the air pressure is approximately 760. Remember this number, 760 millimeter of mercury. So when I say 760, I said 760 millimeter of mercury, but we are not using that word. Say 760, just for our discussion purpose. So the air pressure normally where we are living in the sea level in Long Island. So the air pressure is 760. Now, if you go on top of Mount Everest or any other top mountain, yes, of course, the air pressure decreases. Okay, but not so much that it will affect the breathing until you reach really, really high. That's why, when the people go on top of the mountain, such as like Everest, they will carry their own oxygen. Okay. Same thing, if you go down the deep sea diver, they carry their own oxygen because the air pressure changes. So right now in Long Island, the air pressure is 760. So outside environmental pressure is 760. Now, if you consider, this is important to understand, so pay attention to this one. If you consider that the that the air pressure of the lung is also 760, that means there is no air movement. So the air is not moving because both 760. Now by some way, some technique, if we decrease the air pressure, how do we decrease it? If we could increase the volume of the lung. So how can we do that? The easiest way to understand it, that's why I'm going to explain that. Your diaphragm muscle. Diaphragm is like a dome-shaped muscle. So if we decrease that diaphragm somehow, if we decrease that diaphragm somehow, let me see if we have a picture of that. Unfortunately not. Okay, so if we decrease a diaphragm from the lung, what that will happen is they will increase the volume of the lung. They will automatically increase the volume of the lung. So if we decrease the diaphragm, I want to get a wide screen. Give me a second. Not possible. Okay, couldn't find that. But anyway, coming back here, there are plenty of picture in your book. So whenever you are going to give a reading, you will find that. What I want to explain is, when you decrease, if you lower the diaphragm, that means your diaphragm is like a dome-shaped muscle. If you lower that dome, what that do, that increases the volume of the lung. So when you constrict when you contract the muscle of the diaphragm, because diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, so you can voluntarily do it. When you do that, they will increase the volume of the lung. As soon as the lung volume is increased, the pressure will decrease. So from 760, let's say it becomes 758. So outside is 760, lung is 758, so automatically the air will go from outside to inside. And that is called inspiration or inhalation. Now you push that dome-shaped muscle back into the lung again. You're pushing a little bit harder. So the lung volume will go down, meaning lung volume will reduce. And when the lung volume reduces, the pressure in the lung will increase, because we already know the Boyle's law. We already know the Boyle's law. The Boyle's law says that volume and the pressure of a gas, if you keep the temperature constant, we're not changing the temperature. If you keep the temperature constant, volume and the pressure of the gas are inversely proportional, meaning if the volume increases, the pressure will decrease. If the volume decreases, the pressure will increase. So they're opposite to each other. So we are controlling the volume of the lung. So if we increase the volume of the lung, pressure decrease. If the pressure decrease, the air will go out. Air will come in, sorry. If the pressure decrease in the lung, the air come in from the outside. Same opposite thing will happen when you decrease the volume of the lung. That's how you breathe. That is called mechanism of breathing. Now, obviously, there is not one muscle that control the lung volume. You have costal muscle, like intercostal muscle between the rib bones. Those are involved. You have diaphragm muscle. Those are involved. And sometimes when you do really hard breathing, your abdominal muscle is also involved. Depending on all these things, we divide our breathing into two patterns. One is called quiet breathing, the other one is called forced breathing. So quiet breathing, which is commonly known as eupnea, eu means good, nia means breathing. So good breathing or quiet breathing, meaning they involve an active inhalation. What does that mean? Active inhalation means your skeletal muscle contract here. And we know from ANP1, in order to contract skeletal muscle, you need ATP. So you burn ATP to contract the skeletal muscle. So you just imagine only one example. Your diaphragm is contracted. So diaphragm contract, volume increases, pressure decreases, air coming in. That kind of breathing, which is commonly known as diaphragmatic breathing. Same thing, coastal breathing, like your muscle of the rib cage, they are changing your rib cage by contracting and relaxing. So when they contract, the rib cage goes up a little bit and then the volume increases. When the volume increases, the pressure decreases, air moves in. These both kind of breathing, they involve a passive exhalation. What is passive exhalation? Passive means you actively contract the diaphragm, but you don't actively relax them. The muscle will relax by themselves. So if you contract the diaphragm, that is you're spending ATP to do it, then muscle will automatically relax. So these are skeletal muscle. At the end of the skeletal muscle, they're like elastic fiber attached. We call them tendons. And those tendons are going to relax the muscle anyway. So quiet breathing or eupnea, which can be classified into diaphragmatic breathing and coastal breathing, depending on what muscle is engaged, involves active inhalation and passive exhalation. But if you go to the forced breathing, or we call them hyperpnea, they have both active. They have active inhalation and active exhalation. That means you're actively breathing in both the cases. So you inhale and exhale both in an active way. So what does that exactly mean? That means inhalation is active. We know that, let's say, diaphragm, we actively contract. But if you practice later on, like for example, like if you're running on a treadmill for 20 minutes, then your breathing rate increases and your breathing pattern changes from passive to active, because now you're forcefully breathing out. So your abdominal muscle get engaged on top of the diaphragm. So they are trying to push the diaphragm even more so that you can breathe out more air. And more air you breathe out, more air you breathe in. So when you leave, your breathing pattern goes to that level, like maximum levels occur in exhaustion, that's called forced breathing. So breathing, depending on which muscle is active, we can categorize it two groups, like depending on inhalation and exhalation, both are passive or both are active, or one passive, one active. Depending on that, we have two groups. Then I mentioned two different types of breathing because a lot of questions come about the apnea and dyspnea. You don't need the mechanism here. So these are the defect, or I would say these are the changes in homeostasis. Like, for example, I'm sure you heard about the word sleep apnea. So apnea means cessation of breathing. So during sleep, some people have that, they just get a little bit time, the breathing ceases somehow. So how, we do not need to know right now, because this is not a class that we talk about disease a lot, but I'm going to mention of this. Dyspnea is like a shortness of breath. And okay, so again, the reason could be anything, but that is the, so if I ask a question regarding this, I'm not going to ask like what causes dyspnea. I'm going to ask like labored or grasping breathing is known as. So once we know this, once we know how we breathe, what we need to know first, that there are two more things to learn in this chapter. One is how gas is being transported and from, like, oxygen and carbon dioxide, how they transport from the lung to the blood vessels and therefore to the body. And the second part is the different amount of air we breathe in at different time. We call them collectively the respiratory volumes. So I'm going to mention that first, and then we're going to go to the transport area. So respiratory volumes means, this is the part you have to be a little bit, like you have to practice a little bit later on, and you have to write down those things later on. Okay. These are different amount of volume. Some of them are clinically used. Okay, but what does that mean? Means normally at rest, like right now, for example, we are not doing any exercise, we are not doing any exhausting cause right now. We are just sitting and learning. So this is our like normal time, I would say, when our homeostasis is normal. At that time, when you're breathing air, you're breathing in right now, so you're breathing in air and breathing out air, that amount we call tidal volume. So tidal volume, or TV, is commonly, the definition is like this: the amount of air a person can inhale or exhale, or, keyword, that's a very important one, or. So the amount of air a person can inhale or exhale at rest. So when you're at rest, rest means right now, actually we're just learning, not too much physical activity, or when you're sleeping. It's that time, the amount of air you breathe in or breathe out. So we do the same amount, we breathe in and we breathe out, the same amount, which is approximate value is 500 ml. Now, obviously, in different person has a little bit different, so it has a range, like it could be anywhere from 350 to 650, but no matter what it says in your book, you are going to follow this amount to easily understand this. And at the end, I put a table also, all this volume. So we are going to follow one value like this, whatever it's written. Even if my other slide says something else, we are all going to follow this volume. So because if I ask a question in the test, you're going to follow these values. Okay, this is taken from the book that you're using. So we are all on the same page. Obviously, these values are not written in stone. That's why different book says a little bit different amount. But for our exam purpose, we are going to follow the value that's written in our book, like this one. So tidal volume is 500 ml. So now that is the air you breathe in and out all the time. Like all the time means when you are at rest. But the question is, like, what if you want to breathe a little bit extra? Okay, what happens if you want to breathe a little bit extra? Let's say, just imagine this situation. You are diving in a pool. So right before you get to the dive in a pool, what do? You take a deep breath. So that means you have the ability to take more air. You just don't do it all the time, but you do have the ability to take more air if you need to. That's called inspiratory reserve volume. That means the maximum amount, inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV, the maximum amount of air that is inspired or inhaled by a person after a normal tidal volume, meaning after a normal inspiration. So this is important to understand. So that is the additional amount of air you can take in. So what is inspiratory reserve volume? Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air, the maximum amount of air you can inhale after a normal inhalation. So the TV you are doing anyway, this is the on top of that. So that's close to be like 3 liters. So your TV could be like just half a liter. But after that, if you want to, you can take a deep breath, like approximately 3 liters of extra air if you need. Similarly, expiratory reserve volume, meaning at the end of normal expiration, which is the TV again, like at the end of that 500, you can evacuate a little bit more air. You can expire a little bit more air. So you can define ERV is the amount of air one can exhale after a normal exhalation. So normal exhalation, when you say normal exhalation, we actually mean tidal volume. So after that, if you want, you can still get it out another 1200 ml, which you don't do it all the time, because all the time you don't breathe out extra air. You don't do, that's extra air breathing. You don't do all the time, but if you want to, you can. Residual volume. This is the one that stays in the lung. You don't breathe them out. You can't breathe them out. That stays in the lung. So the amount of air that remains in the lung all the time. Because you don't want, we discussed that a little bit the other day, like about the septal cells. Like we do not want lung to collapse completely. It's like a balloon. If you allow the lung to collapse completely, you need more force to open them up. So you don't want them. So you keep some air because of the surfactant. The alveolus is a little bit like a bubble. So there's some air are trapped there all the time. That's like a residual volume or RV. Okay. Now, these are so-called volumes, and then we use the word capacity. So meaning like, I'm going to go right here. Inspiratory capacity. So what is inspiratory capacities means? Like the maximum amount of air one can inspire. That means that is your capacity. So remember, you're inspiring two things. One is normal, that is tidal volume, which you're doing all the time. And again, remember, if you want to, you can take more. So it's like, having coffee in the morning. So you every day, let's say you drink a cup of coffee in the morning, but some days you're a little bit like stressed or whatever. You want to keep yourself awake. If you want to, you drink a couple of cups more. So now if I ask you, like, what is your capacity of how much coffee you can drink? You say, hey, I can drink 5 cups. That doesn't mean you take 5 cups all the time. You take 1 cup all the time, but you can take up to more if you need. Same thing here. So inspiratory capacity is the IRV and TV together. So if you want to, you can. Same thing with this one, like expiratory reserve volume. That is the amount if you want to, you can breathe out extra. Normally, this amount, the ERV, that stays in the lung. But RV is the amount that stays lung no matter what. So even if you want, you cannot breathe out this 1200, 1300 extra. So let's go with the 1300 because that's your book says. That 1300 ml, you cannot breathe out even if you want to. You can't. But you can breathe out this 1200 if you want to, but you don't all the time. It's like, I'll give you an example to understand this. It's like the money in the bank. So let's say your checking account has like $500. Okay, $500, and every day you withdraw $50 in the morning, and in the evening you deposit $50. That's your practice. You withdraw $50, you use that, and you earn that $50 during the day, and you put it back. So you have the 500 all the time. And if you want to, it's your money. If you want to, you can take out a little bit extra. Let's say you take out $400 extra, which is this amount. You can. That's ERV. But you cannot take out all 500 because the bank requires you to keep a minimum deposit. So let's say your minimum deposit is $50. So you cannot take out that $50. So you can take out $50 every day. If you want, you can take out another 400. So total 450 you can take out, but last 50 you cannot take out, because if you take out, then they will charge you some money or penalty, or your bank account will be closed. Just imagine that. But normally, how much is in your bank? 450, because you're taking out only 50. If you want, you can take out the other 400. Same thing in the lung. This 1300 remains in the lung all the time. This 1200 still in the lung, but if you want, you can take out. So 13 plus 12 is 2500 ml of air normally stays in the lung. That is together we call functional reserve volume, FRV, or functional residual capacity. So some book will use the word FRC, some book will use the word FRV, functional residual volume. That means the amount of air that stays in your lung after a normal expiration, after a normal exhalation. So if you take out only $50, the remaining part is called FRV in the example that I give you. Vital capacity. That's the vital capacity is the maximum, pay attention to the definition, the maximum amount of air one can exhale after a maximum inhalation. So if you take a deep breath, later on you can practice. If you take a deep breath, now you cannot release only the TV. You got to release everything you took, because all your muscles are now engaged. That's what called vital capacity. That's a very important sign for your clinical health as well, because out of this vital capacity, the amount that you accept, once you take a deep breath, more than 80% comes out on your first second. If you're a healthy individual, if you do not have blockage in your lung passageways, meaning which is commonly referred to as like COPD, some people have asthma, so some people have emphysema, all these respiratory diseases. If you don't have those, you are going to take, like breathe out 80% or more air on the first second. Okay, so that's why in your lab manual, they're going to mention something called FVC1, because VC is sometimes also known as FVC, forced vital capacity. Some books use that word. Instead of saying just vital capacity, like your lab manual will use the word forced vital capacity, FVC. And so they use the word FVC, forced vital capacity, or FVC1, or FEV1, like forced expiratory volume 1. 1 means on the first second. And if on the first second you can breathe out, normal people will breathe out 80% or more air. And if you can't, then doctor knows you have some kind of problem. Either you're suffering from allergies or any kind of diseases that can temporarily affect your lung, or you have a permanent defect in your lung, either or. So your VC will be reduced on the first second. Finally, total lung capacity, meaning the maximum amount of air your lung can hold. So it's like more than like 6 liters. So that's a maximum. So when you take a deep breath, that is the amount in your lung. It's called total lung capacity. Now, so again, not only you need to know the definition of it, but also the values. So you need to practice. Okay, you need to practice. You need to write down a couple of times whenever you get a chance. So some like 2 questions I will ask in the practical as well, like lab practical, about the values. We are going to discuss that later on. Or I can ask you in the second lecture exam as well, like what is tidal volume? So if I give you the choices that has value, that means I'm asking for value, or I am asking for the definition, either or. So you need to know both. Alveolar ventilation. meaning the amount of fresh air. I'm using the word fresh intentionally because we talked about the anatomical dead space. So now if you go back, it's simple math though. It's a simple math. So if we go back right here, the tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled or exhaled in one cycle, okay? So it should be or. This word, if you put and, this word, like the definition becomes a little bit tricky. So I would refer to the word or, meaning the amount, whatever you take in, that's the same amount you breathe out. So let's say 500 ml you took in. Now, out of that 500 ml, 30%, which is 150 ml, staying in your conducting zone structure. Now, to refresh your memory, remember your whole respiratory tract is from nose or mouth to pharynx, to larynx, to trachea, to bronchi, and then terminal bronchial, respiratory bronchial, alveolar duct, and alveoli. From nose to terminal bronchial, they're not doing any physiological work. No physiological activity there. No gas exchange there. So that's anatomical dead space. So when you take out 500 ml, out of that, 150 ml stays in that area. So only 350 ml, the remaining part, is reaching alveoli. That's the fresh air going to the alveoli. That's the fresh air that is going to participate in the gas exchange process. So that every time you breathe in, I'm assuming you are breathing in 500 ml of air, only 350 is doing the work, meaning only 70% is doing the work. Doing the work means they are participating in the gas exchange. So if you breathe in, let's say 12 times per minute, like our breathing rate is 10 to 12 times. So if you breathe 12 times per minute. So in 1 minute, your lung is receiving mathematically this 350 times 12, so approximately a little bit over 4 liters of air in a minute. That is known as alveolar ventilation rate. So alveolar ventilation rate is the amount of air that reaches alveoli per minute. The amount of air that reaches, not the amount of air you breathe, the amount of air that reaches alveoli. Why it is different? Because we just learned that no matter what we breathe, portion of it stays in the anatomical dead space. So they don't do the work. So we are considering only the part they're doing the work, because that's where it is taking place, the gas exchange. So that is what is most important, because that is where the blood gets oxygen. So these are called respiratory volume, which can be defined by this graphical representation as well. So this is the amount like you normally breathe in. So breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. That's what we're doing. So that's a tidal volume. It's light blue color in these pictures, tidal volume. And then if you want, you can breathe in a lot of air. So this additional volume that you're breathing in is called respiratory reserve volume. So if you have the ability to breathe in this much, and then you have the ability to breathe in this much. So together, from here to here, so that we call it inspiratory capacity. Same thing, you have the ability to breathe out that much, but if you want, you can breathe out additional one. This additional one is called expiratory reserve volume. And this portion that stays in your lung, that's called residual volume. So together, the expiratory reserve volume and residual volume, we can call functional residual capacity or functional residual volume. Now, when you're talking about residual volume, one additional thing you got to understand. What is that additional thing? See that they put a darker color right there? That's approximately 30 to 120 ml, which is the part of the residual volume. So this amount stays in your lung, but this minimal volume, some book will call minimal residual volume, MRV, or this minimal volume, 30 to 100 ml, 30 to 120 ml. This amount, even the lung is collapsed, it stays there. because your alveoli all are microscopic in structure. You cannot, unless, like if you take out someone's lungs and like stab them a couple of times, still this air will be there. You can't take them out because they're trapped into those microscopic alveolar structure. Okay. Now, how do you define that? You can define like the minimum volume of air that stays in the lung, even if the lungs are allowed to collapse. So residual volume means the lungs are not collapsed, the healthy lungs. But even if you allow the lungs to collapse, this amount, you can't really breathe them out. That's called minimal volume. Okay, so these are about the pulmonary volumes and capacities. Now, final part of this chapter is the gas exchange, meaning we know oxygen goes from alveolus to the blood and carbon dioxide comes from blood to the alveolus. The mechanism is simple diffusion. Mechanism is simple diffusion. That means wherever there is a high concentration of oxygen, that will flow from to the low concentration of oxygen. Now, we do not use the word concentration pretty often when we talk about the gas. We use the word pressure. So they're moving from high pressure to low pressure. Okay. Now, how do we know that what is the pressure of oxygen? In order to understand that, we need to focus a little bit on the composition of air, that what makes air, and we need to understand what is the oxygen contribution in that air pressure. Now, air pressure, first of all, the composition of air is mostly nitrogen, like 78.6% nitrogen. It's almost like 79%. And then 20% oxygen, like 20.9 technically. The remaining a little bit is carbon dioxide and water vapor. Of course, this is like the pure air, but there are a lot of impurities in the air also, which belongs to like less than 0.001%. So our main guys are nitrogen and oxygen in the air. So now, what is air pressure again? Air pressure is the amount of pressure given by the air. But obviously, as air is the mixture of gases, so not all the air pressure is related to nitrogen or oxygen or water vapor or carbon dioxide. So then Dalton, who gave a law, we call them Dalton's law. What is Dalton's law is that referred to the partial pressure, meaning the total pressure of air is actually contributed by the individual gases that makes up that mixture. And how they contribute? They contribute according to their abundance. So before even we talk about chemistry, let's talk about simple business. Simple. So let's say I am doing a business with two of you. So total 3 person is doing a business, A, B, and C. Okay, total 3 person doing a business. So let's say when we started the business, I contributed only 10%. Somebody else contributed 60%. So 10 plus 60, 70%, and somebody else contributed 30%. So student 1 contributed 60%, student 2 contributed 30%, and I contributed 10%. So when that business is going to make profit, obviously we cannot divide them equally. So we are going to divide according to the investment. So the student that invested 60% is going to take the 60% of the profit. Same thing, student B who's invested 30% is going to take 30% of the profit. And I invested only 10%, I'm going to take the 10% of the profit. Same thing here. So we talked about that at the sea level, the pressure of gas is 760 millimeter of mercury. So out of that, the nitrogen is responsible 78.6% of that, so 597 millimeter of mercury. Oxygen is responsible 20.9% of that, and so on. So we are interested in this number, 159. So oxygen in the air is 159 millimeter of mercury. When you breathe in, that oxygen, I'm not talking about the air anymore. We are focusing only on oxygen because that's our interest of gas. So that oxygen is going through all the pipelines, becoming narrower and narrower, and then reaches to the alveoli. So when it comes to the alveoli, right over here, so when you're breathing in, right over here, so when you're breathing in oxygen for outside 159, when they come into the alveolar, they drop to 105. So some book will refer to 105, some book will say 100, because of the resistance they got from all the tubes or the pipelines. So one more time, outside the air pressure is 760, air pressure, but the oxygen pressure is 159. That 159 will drop it down to 105, 100 in the alveoli. Okay. Now, why this is important? The important is this: when scientists measured that the oxygen coming from the lung to the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary capillaries, the oxygen pressure is approximately 40 millimeter of mercury. So oxygen pressure is 40 here, oxygen pressure is 105 here, the rest is pretty easy, because we know that diffusion will take place from high to low pressure. So oxygen will go from here to the capillaries, and then they will go through your body. So the heart and blood vessel is engaged. Same thing with carbon dioxide. When carbon dioxide is returning, the carbon dioxide in the blood is 45. Their pressure is 45. But when you calculate in the lung, it is 40. So 45 is higher than 40, so carbon dioxide will go from the blood capillary to the lung. That is the basis of the gas exchange. So 100 to 105 here, outside is 40, so they rapidly comes in to the blood carries them, cells use them. So when the cell using them, they're releasing carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide rich blood coming back into the capillary. The carbon dioxide is 45 millimeter pressure here, carbon dioxide 40 here, so they go this way and they exhale the carbon dioxide. That's the fundamentals of the gas exchange. So this is taken from another book. That's why the oxygen appears 100. So 100, 105 is fine. So this is alveolus. That's the volume coming up from the heart. So again, the oxygen pressure is 40, carbon dioxide 45. In the alveolus, oxygen is 100, carbon dioxide 40. So oxygen goes this way, carbon dioxide goes that way. That's through the respiratory membrane. We learned that before. That's called external gas exchange. Now, who carry this oxygen? Why so much oxygen is going in? Why so much oxygen? So oxygen is supposed to go like, if this is 40, this is 100, so the middle is 70, so oxygen should be 70 here, but look at the oxygen here. It's like 100 again. So much oxygen is getting in. The question is why? The reason is hemoglobin. So much, the same thing here, the same concept, but why? The reason is hemoglobin. Because in the blood, now we're going to focus on the blood a little bit. So in the blood, we have RBC and blood plasma, those who are involved in carrying oxygen. Okay, carbon dioxide coming up later on. So now in the blood, the 98 or more even percentage is bound with hemoglobin directly. So what happening is this is, you have to imagine this. As soon as the oxygen goes into the blood, little bit dissolved in blood plasma, but most of them captured by hemoglobin, because hemoglobin, remember, made with 4 polypeptide chain, 2 alpha, 2 beta, and at the end of each chain there is a group attached, organic group called heme. At the center of that heme group there is an iron atom, and the iron directly bind with oxygen. We learned that in blood chapter. Because of that nature, tremendous amount of oxygen can be bound. When oxygen bind with hemoglobin, we call that oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. When oxygen, and the word we use, we call hemoglobin is saturated. So hemoglobin is saturated, it means that hemoglobin bound with oxygen. That means hemoglobin is saturated. Okay. Carbon dioxide, when they bind with hemoglobin, by the way, we call carbaminohemoglobin. So when oxygen bind, we call oxyhemoglobin. when carbon dioxide bind to the hemoglobin, we call carbaminohemoglobin. They bind it a little bit different way. We are going to talk about that later. So now oxygen, this is what oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin is saturated here. Deoxyhemoglobin, because hemoglobin is not binding with oxygen. So what 100% saturation means all hemoglobin molecules is bound with oxygen and so on. So that means what heme does in the hemoglobin, they bind with oxygen and then they carry them to the tissue. And in the tissue, they're releasing it, okay? This binding depends on few factors. This is the same picture. This binding depends on few factors. What are those factors? The number one factors I'm going to teach you from these two slides. The number one factor is the partial pressure. So higher the pressure, higher is the binding. So one more time, we're talking about hemoglobin saturation curve, meaning hemoglobin binding with oxygen. Like why hemoglobin is so much interested in oxygen. Which factor define this? Three factors. Number one, the partial pressure. So higher the pressure, higher is the binding. So look at the 10 partial pressure, the binding is 13.5, but the 20 binding is 35, and 30 binding is 57, and so on. In other words, they are not linear. If it is a linear scale, this will go like this way, straight line. But it's so-called a sigmoid curve, meaning it goes rapidly. I'll give you a mathematical explanation. 10 partial pressure binding, let's say 13, just mathematically. Okay, so 20 should bind 26, but 20 already bound 35. Why? This kind of binding, when you're reading the book, you'll find this word, is called cooperative binding. Cooperative binding, meaning when one hemoglobin chain, like, remember hemoglobin has 4 polypeptide chains. When one of them binds to an oxygen, the second one binds faster. And the third one binds even faster. This is called cooperative binding. Okay. So because of that, even with the 60 partial pressure, you don't have to go to 100. You have to 60 partial pressure. Look at that. Almost 90% hemoglobin is bound. So whether your partial pressure is 100 or 90 or 80, more than 95% hemoglobin is bound, so you can be healthy. That's why if you go from like sea level, which is our partial pressure in the lung is 100, if we go to like, let's say Catskill Mountain, we do not need any additional equipment, because even the partial pressure drop by like 5 or 10, we have almost same amount of oxygen. But if you go to Everest or any other top mountain, like their partial pressure is so low, then you need to have oxygen tank with you. Also, there are two more factors that directly influence the binding of the gas is pH and temperature. So pH, when the pH is low, the binding is low. Higher pH, binding is high. Remember, more this side is more binding. This is more release. So lower pH, low binding, higher pH, high binding. Opposite in case of temperature, higher pH, higher temperature, low binding, lower temperature, less binding. That's why sometimes, hypothermia is really, really bad, because if your body temperature decreases very rapidly, your body is not going to release the oxygen. And if the hemoglobin binds tightly with the oxygen, your brain cannot receive enough oxygen. So that's why hypothermia, people get initially dizzy and then they can get into coma because your brain not getting enough oxygen. On the other hand, if you have fever a little bit, then body release more oxygen to the tissue so the tissue can function well. How can we manipulate that? Like there is one molecule that we can look at to understand how much blood is binding to the oxygen. That's called BPG, bisphosphoglycerate. Even if you forgot about this molecule in ANP1, you learn briefly this. This is one of the molecules in the process of glycolysis. Okay, one of the molecules in the process of glycolysis. And we know glycolysis is breakdown of glucose into two molecules of pyruvic acid. The reason body does it to generate ATP. So RBC, they don't have mitochondria. They do always anaerobic respiration. I think you learn in ANP1. So they break down glucose to pyruvic acid molecules. During that process, they generate BPG. So they are directly related. How they're related? More BPG, more oxygen released. So if the RBC has more BPG in it, and we know they cannot bind with oxygen better because they already used up their energy. Think about this way. So more BPG, more oxygen release. That means hemoglobin saturation is low because they cannot bind oxygen effectively. So that's all about oxygen binding. Now, how about carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide has a little bit more chemistry, but the process is simple. So I'm going to skip this. This is just oxygen. We just talked about that. And I'm going to skip this slide, which I'm going to teach you from this slide. Okay. So carbon dioxide, two things happen. Carbon dioxide, when comes in from the tissue to the blood, remember carbon dioxide is the opposite way. They come from the tissue to the blood, and then blood carry them. When they come in the lung, they go from the blood to the alveolus, opposite of oxygen. Oxygen goes from alveolus to the blood, and then blood carried to the tissue. Here, coming from the tissue. So when they come from the tissue, these are the 3% you got to memorize. That 7% dissolves in blood plasma, 23% dissolves in bind with hemoglobin called carbaminohemoglobin, and 70% react with water. So three things: 7% bind with blood plasma, so that's a 7%. 23% bind with hemoglobin, and 70% react with water because they have the enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. That enzyme, when the carbon dioxide react with water, produce carbonic acid. That's why the name carbonic anhydrase, the enzyme, that's in the RBC. Once carbonic acid is produced, they break down into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion or proton. This hydrogen ion will be accepted by the hemoglobin, so the pH does not vary. But this bicarb ion, which is very important, they have other functions, which you do not need to know right now. They have other functions as a buffer in the body. They come out in the plasma in exchange for chloride ion. So look one more time. So they react with water, carbon dioxide react with water in presence of the enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, break down to carbonic acid. Carbonic acid break down to HCO3 bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ion is accepted by hemoglobin, so the pH does not change. The bicarbonic acid goes out, bicarbonate ion goes outside, chloride comes in. That phenomena is called chloride shift. That phenomena is called chloride shift, and it happens right here this way. The opposite way it happens in the lung. The chloride goes out, bicarbonate comes in, bind with hydrogen, carbonic acid, water goes out, carbon dioxide, this carbon dioxide comes out, this all carbon dioxide go out. So whatever happened here, if you know that, you just reverse the arrow, you're going to know what happened here. And that is how the gas is being exchanged. So that's the whole respiratory system.